So my name is Lily Haynes, and I work for the Clark Fork Coalition here in Missoula, Montana. The Clark Fork Coalition, of course, is the host of this event tonight. A quick plug for the Clark Fork Coalition. Our mission is to protect and restore the Clark Fork watershed, which covers 14 million acres and supports over 350,000 people in Western Montana. For over 30 years, we have been working in science-based, community-driven river protection and restoration. So science-based means that we are committed to bringing the best available science to the forefront of watershed management here. Community-driven means that we believe wholeheartedly in the power of informed and active communities to help with that mission of protecting the watershed. So you can learn more about the Clark Fork Coalition by visiting our website, and that link is included in the video description on Facebook, and I'll throw it here into the comments on Zoom really quick. On our website, you can sign up to join our mailing list. You can become a supporting member of the work we do. And you can also learn more about joining our Water Watchdog team, which is a special group of citizens who are engaged right now in advocating for the river during this current legislative session. All right, it looks like we are getting pretty full, and so I think we're ready to begin. Thank you all again for joining our happy hour live today. If you are on Zoom, our comments are going to be turned off, but you can ask questions and give your comments using the question and answer feature that's there at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you are joining us on Facebook, we will watch in the comments of the video for your questions, and we'll do our best to get those to our speakers today. So to start our conversation, we would like to acknowledge that our watershed is the home to many different Indigenous peoples, and especially this area is the heart of the homeland for the Salish and Kalispel cultures and people. We would like to honor that path that they have always shown us in caring for our watershed for generations to come. And we recognize that talking about water rights, we're talking about rights that are closely tied to those nations' sovereign rights. Our focus tonight is to shine a light on the creation and enforcement and defense of Montana's clean water laws. We'll be exploring the legal framework that we depend on to protect clean water in Montana, and we'll be examining how everyday Montanans play an important role in ensuring that that machinery works to protect our rights. And for our conversation today, we are going to be joined by a cast of absolute powerhouse speakers. I'm so honored and excited to have these people's perspectives in the conversation today. We're in for a real treat. These people have been major influencers when we talk about protecting and improving the environment in Montana. So tonight we're going to be joined by Mae Nan Ellingson, who is a retired lawyer, and she was a delegate in the 1972 Montana Constitutional Convention. She helped author the Preamble to our Constitution and helped lead the fight to secure citizens' right to a clean and healthful environment. When I say she was the youngest delegate at that Constitution, she was 24 at the time, but Mae Nan corrected me the other day that she is still the youngest delegate at the Constitutional Convention. When you ask Mae Nan's colleagues about the work she's done, they say she is a true powerhouse. And as one of her colleagues put it, we enjoy the rule of law because of people like Mae Nan Ellingson. It's a huge blessing and it's a huge deal. That we've got with her we've got in Montana one of the most admired constitutions in the country, and that is thanks in large part to people like Mae Nan. We're also joined by Justice Jim Nelson, a retired Montana Supreme Court Justice who, over his 19-year tenure, repeatedly took a strong stance on the broad protections afforded under Montana's constitutional right to that clean and healthful environment. Justice Nelson participated in numerous legal decisions interpreting the clean and healthful environment right and enforcing Montana's water protection laws. And I'm very excited to hear his thoughts on that interpretation and just what is packed into that phrase. Outside of the environmental rights, Justice Nelson is well known for his opinions regarding the rights of every person in our state. And after his retirement from the court, Justice Nelson continues to be active in writing and commenting on our Constitution, always as an outspoken advocate for civil rights and for a fair, impartial, and independent judicial branch. We're also joined by Tracy Stone-Manning, a huge name here at the Clark Fork Coalition. Tracy was a one-time executive director of our organization, went on to be a director of the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, the DEQ, was former chief of staff for Montana Governor Steve Bullock, and now is the associate VP for the public lands with the National Wildlife Federation. Last but not least, we have my fearless leader, Clark Fork Coalition Executive Director, Karen Knudsen. And Karen is a veteran of campaigns mobilizing citizens to protect clean water resources in the Clark Fork Basin. So with that little bit of background, I'm going to invite all of our speakers to turn their cameras on and join us here on screen. Again, you guys, if you're just tuning in, welcome to the Clark Fork Coalition's Happy Hour Live conversation. We're just getting started and bringing our speakers up on stage. Hello. Speakers, you can unmute if you'd like. And to jump into our conversation today, you know, in the last 50 years, Montana has come a long way in improving our lands and our rivers, our skies, our air, things that were seriously degraded after a long run of resource extraction in the state. And so I'd like to open and give our audience a chance to hear from you personally. And I'm going to ask you guys what things were like when you first became involved, either personally or professionally, in protection of Montana's environment. And Mae Nan, I'm wondering if you want to start us out kind of setting the stage of what things were like when you first got into the work.
Well, my first act of environmental activism wasn't with respect to water, but it was with respect to air. And in 1970, I joined a group here in Missoula, Gals Against Smog and Pollution. We called ourselves GAS. And our biggest concern in Missoula at that time was the fact that you could not see Mount Sentinel from the university because of the particulate in the air, most of it caused by Horner-Waldorf. And so my early activism beginning in 1970 was related to air.
Awesome. And we might have just lost, which, man, technology these days, we might have just lost Justice Nelson, but I'm sure he'll come back on. So we'll skip over him for a second and move on to Tracy. Kind of the same question to you. What were things like when you first got involved in this work?
First of all, there wasn't the ability to gather on a flat screen. There was probably not email. So things have changed quite a bit. Back when I was working with Karen on issues around the Clark Fork, when we asked people to get in touch with their electeds, it was picking up the phone or sending a fax or writing a letter or filling out a postcard on the street. So the thing that is stalwart and deeply the same are Montanans' connections to the outdoors. There's this fundamentally shared, beautiful value that we all care about clean water. We all care about clean air. We recognize that we took some missteps in the past. There's not a single, I've never run into a Montanan who has said, well, yeah, I'm for dirty water. Nobody is. And that has been the sort of common theme through the decades of this work. The other thing that I think has been a beautiful thing to watch is how, as communities, we literally used to turn our backs to our rivers. Our rivers carried our trash away. When I started, that was no longer the case. We were turning our faces to the river. Karis Park was built, things like that in downtown Missoula. Now we gather around rivers. We have parties next to rivers. We gather on rivers, almost almost too much so now. But rivers have become a through line for all the communities up and down the Clark Fork watershed. And that too has been a beautiful thing to watch. And I can't help but notice here on, since we're talking about flat screens, that Karen and I have the same thing hanging on our wall, which is, speaking of beautiful imagery, which is Monty Dolek's depiction of the Shadow Dam at the confluence of the Blackfoot and Clark Fork rivers, which he did for the coalition back in the day.
That is, I'm glad you pointed that out, Tracy. I hadn't noticed that. Justice Nelson, would you care to chime in here and just kind of paint a picture of what things were like when you maybe started practicing law in Montana, which was before you joined the court in 1993, but give us that picture of where you started.
Well, actually, I started in Washington, D.C. I went to law school at George Washington University and worked for the Securities and Exchange Commission during the day and went to law school at night. But the education, legal education I got in Washington, D.C. was pretty much out of the book standard legal principles. There was certainly nothing unique about any state, certainly not Montana. So when I graduated and my wife and I and our 2 young children decided that we would return to Montana, and I was going to go into practice with my father-in-law in Cutbank, Wilbur Warner. And of course, I had to take the DC bar, or the Montana bar. People that graduated from the University of Montana then did not. But anyway, I got a set of the RCMs and read everything about Montana that was unique to Montana that I hadn't learned in law school, including Montana's 1972 Constitution. And I, frankly, when I read that, I was just blown away. It was literally the most beautiful, most progressive Constitution that I had ever read. And I thought, you know, I'm going to be lucky to go back there and practice in this state. And so I did. And in the general practice of law, you don't get faced with a whole lot of constitutional issues. Although I was county attorney for 14 of the 20 years I was in Cutbank. And I always tried to govern my criminal law practice as county attorney, guided by Montana's Constitution, which provided a lot more rights to people than the federal Constitution. So then when I was appointed to the court in 1993, I really got a chance to get into the Constitution, and my goal was to, as a justice, was to try to make the Constitution work for people. The Constitution is the people's document. It's not the government's document. we're the people. We own the Constitution. It's our document. And I was committed to trying to make the Constitution work for the people of Montana. I think the first big case we got into with regard to the Article 2, Section 3, right to a clean and healthful environment, was of course the NEIC case in 1999. Justice Terry Trio wrote the opinion. And we had a great court at the time. There was a majority of the court, in fact, pretty much everybody on the court was committed to advancing the Constitution, to make it work, to start giving some voice to these beautiful rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, and to make it work for the people. And so we did that with the first MEIC case. It was what I would consider a landmark case, and it kind of got the road, show on the road as far as Article 2, Section 3 went with regard to the Constitution. I'm not going to go on, but let me make one final closing remark here. And we had talked about this a little bit in the dry run we had the other night. Mm-hmm. We tend to think, and of course, this dialogue is focused on water rights, and particularly Clark Fork River and the water rights end of the Constitution, Article 2, Section 3. But I think we all need to remember, especially in this time in our history, in the country and in our state, that it's a right to a clean and healthful environment. And that environment includes a lot more things than just water, although water is, of course, essential. It includes air. It includes ecosystems. It includes the climate change issues that we're dealing with now. And if I would challenge anybody to do anything that's listening in on this dialogue tonight, is that don't forget how important Article 2, Section 3, the right to a clean and healthful environment, is to you and your children and your grandchildren and all your ancestors from here on out, or your descendants. It's just that important, and it's something we have to fight for and preserve. And it's going to be a fight for the next 4 to 8 years, I would guess. Not trying to cast aspersions on any other branch of government, but we might as well be realistic about it. And it's going to be up to each one of us to contact our legislator, contact our governor, and to fight for these rights. They're important. And as with any right, they're all too easily taken away from us if we don't understand what they are, acknowledge their importance, and fight to preserve them.
Well said, Justice Nelson. If you are out there, if you are unfamiliar with the Montana Constitution, it is a fascinating story of how our 1972 version of the Constitution came into being, was written, was ratified, and it really is a beautiful, progressive, and very, very unique document. Justice Nelson, that's fun to hear that you recognize that as a young man practicing, and it helped draw you here. We are so glad you ended up in Montana. Absolutely. We're going to jump into that court case that you referenced in more detail, because it's a fascinating story too. But I want to give Karen a chance to give her perspective here on what it was like when you decided to start down this career. Karen is noted as saying that there was a point in her life where she did not want a career, she wanted a mission. And that helped bring her to us here in Montana, to the Clark Fork Coalition. So tell us a little bit about that.
Great, thanks, Lily. Yeah, okay, so what were things like? Just like Mae Nan, it's the sensory experience that really springs to mind for me first. So when I first became involved in the cause for the river, I was a new resident to Montana and to Missoula. It was 1992. And first off, as a Colorado girl, I was simply awestruck by these vast, broad river valleys, these immense wild places just right out the back door. I mean, it just seemed like nature was at its most multitudinous here in Montana. But on a parallel track in Missoula, in town, I really picked up on this strong residual of this heavy resource extractive past that wasn't always kind to the environment. So in that vein, what really stood out to me in the early 1990s was the more of this sort of smell, touch, see kind of pollution. Mae Nan touched on the pulp mill. Yeah, that was one of my first sensations too. That rotten egg stench of the Smurfitstone pulp mill, the cut over forests and hillsides, the brownish foam, mats of algae, rebar, just general gunk in the river. And then there was that stuff that I couldn't see, but had been warned about, especially since I started work straight out of the gates at the Clark Fork Coalition. But it's those toxic metals from our mining past that the Clark Fork still carried through town. Moving off of the sensory impressions, I will say though, and yes, the civic pride, the passion, the positivity in our community was palpable when I moved here. And I love that. Since I am generally coded for optimism, I just love that. Now that I've put a little distance between the present and 1992, I think I can say that much of that community pride, that determination that I picked up on when I first moved to town, flows straight out of what Justice Nelson has been talking about, straight out of that constitutional guarantee to a clean and healthful environment. I mean, people here don't view this provision as some meaningless abstraction. People see it as a real enforceable right and a responsibility, a clarion call, if you will, for protecting and restoring our natural world. And that's something that I'm sure hoping that tonight's program really reinforces, particularly when Mae Nan walks us through the origin story of the clean and healthful environment provision. And when Justice Nelson and Tracy share more on the powerful legal machinery that not only allows, but calls on citizens to improve the health of Montana's environment. So I know that we'll also explore the central and critical role that Montana citizens have played over time. I'll have some examples on that front, and must continue to play going forward to keep realizing this constitutionally grounded promise of a clean and healthful environment. Before I kick it back to you, Lily, I also though hope this discussion is inspiring and motivating for those who are tuning in, because the fact of the matter is we need you, the river needs you now more than ever. And as you'll hear later from Alex, it's go time on environmental issues with our 2021 legislative session. And it's very clear from some of the bill drafts that many legislators could benefit from a reminder of what the Constitution demands of its legislators and what it holds for its citizens and our remarkable and irreplaceable waterways. So let's get started. Lily, back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Karen. And yeah, if you are just joining us on either the Facebook or the Zoom platform, we're just about to dive into the Bedrock clean water protections in Montana. If you have questions during this conversation, as you're listening to our speakers today, please use the question and answer feature on Zoom to throw those at us. We'll get to as many as we can. If you're joining on Facebook, you can put them in the comment section of the videos and they'll get passed on to us here. And Mae Nan, let's dive into that clean and healthful phrase. You were there, you were one of the principal authors, I think, involved in that. And what came out of that 1972 Constitutional Convention is very, very unique. It is a model for other states. It was very progressive on that environmental right front. So can you tell us about that moment and paint a picture of what it was like? What were the conversations, the people, the sentiments that helped create that clean and healthful phrase?
A little bit of history. Well, I think this is all history we're talking about, right? We're going back to 1972. I actually want to go back to 1970 and 1971 to really paint a picture about why Montana decided to call a constitutional convention in the first place. Not very many states called for constitutional conventions during that period, although there was a big push to do so. But I would like to lay some of the impetus for it at the foot of K. Ross Toole. In 1971, he published a book called Montana, A Land of Extremes, and he dedicated that book to the students of his Montana in the West history class. And this was a very powerful book, and I had been greatly influenced by being one of those students. In his book, he talks about the 70-year history of Montana in the 20th century. And I think it's really important to think about what the whole of Montana was like in 1971. And his history book really does that. It's a fierce and very critical look at Montana having been under the copper collar, as the term was referred to, where the copper company controlled not only the court, not only the legislature, but the press. Montana struggled under the copper collar for so many years. And one of the reasons Montana's environment was in such horrible shape in the early 70s throughout the 60s is because of that copper collar, and because the legislature had failed or refused to really do any regulation of the corporations spoiling the river, the water, or the mining. In 1971, our forests were being clear cut. The Anaconda Copper Company at the mill up in Columbia Falls, that was spewing yellow materials that covered all the trees in green. We had vast strip mining going on in eastern Montana, in addition to the pulp mills here and the teepee burners. And so the air, the water, the earth was being destroyed. When we started preparing for the Constitutional Convention in the fall of 1971, that's when the election was to be a delegate to the convention. There were 100 delegates selected to serve across the state, 8 from Missoula County, 19 of whom were women. Most all of us first-time office holders, because one of the most wonderful and probably telling things about the outcome of the Constitutional Convention was the fact that sitting legislators could not run. And so that opened up the door for a lot of people who had not previously held office on a state level to get involved. More importantly, I think, it severed any long-term relationships that legislators may have had to corporate lobbyists. The corporate lobbyists, they registered, they showed up at the convention, but they did not have the levels of contacts and connections that they had previously had in the legislature. And the convention delegates were very much hands-off in terms of even having interchanges with the corporations who had previously dominated the Constitution, or the old 1889 Constitution, plus the legislature, plus our courts, plus the press. It's interesting, there were about 5 different delegate proposals that dealt with the environment. Proposals calling for a clean and healthful environment. There were proposals calling to enact the public trust doctrine. Those were all referred to a committee that was formed, which was the Natural Resources and Agriculture Committee, which resulted in Article 9. Even bills that would have established the right to a clean and healthful environment as part of the Bill of Rights were referred to the Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee for debate and discussion. There is no question at all, that the hardest fought battle at the Constitutional Convention was the battle over the right to a clean and healthful environment. It lasted long into the night. On 3 days, there were changes of votes. There were proposal after proposal after proposal that those of us who were fighting for this right would put forward, only to have it defeated. And then we would go back and try another tact. Finally, the breaking point came over an amendment to not allow clean and healthful to be a part of the environment. I mean, the way the provision had read at that time was that every citizen had the right to an environment. And so Bob Campbell, a fellow delegate from Missoula, was able to kind of chastise and shame some of the delegates into thinking, what, you're going to leave here and tell people they have the right to an environment? We finally got clean and healthful into that article in the Natural Resources Article 9. And then subsequently, in the final debate on the Bill of Rights Committee, it very importantly got inserted in the inalienable rights section, because as we will talk about as we talk about the cases later, the court really has focused on the linking of the inalienable right to a clean and healthful environment, as well as the right of Montanans and the legislature, the state, to maintain and improve the environment. It's really important to note that we did not trust the legislature to act on the environment. I mean, that's why we have such a strong provision in our Constitution guaranteeing the right. We had waited years and years and years for the legislature to enact environmental legislation, and they were very loath to do so. There are a couple of other points I want to just quickly make about the importance of this article. In Article 9, there is a provision about water. I mean, the third provision of the Natural Resources article relates to water. And Justice Nelson talked a little bit earlier about water rights. Prior to 1972 and the Constitution, Montana never as a state claimed ownership of its water. That was the first statement. We claimed ownership of the water subject to the use and appropriation by its people. But that was a very significant part of the Constitution with respect to water. And then, as Justice Nelson mentioned it, the process then began with the state water courts and the adjudication of all of the water. I guess I'd just like to quickly sum up here a couple of important things, because I really do want to share what I think bound people together at the Constitutional Convention ultimately. And it's reflected in our preamble, which I would very quickly like to read.
Absolutely, Mae Nan.
Okay. Yeah, I'm very proud of it, and I'll emphasize a point after I read it. We, the people of Montana, grateful to God for the quiet beauty of our state, the grandeur of our mountains, the vastness of our rolling plains, and desiring to improve the quality of life, equality of opportunity, and to secure the blessings of liberty for this and future generations, do ordain and establish this Constitution. In writing a preface to a book about the Montana Constitution, former Governor Roscoe said, "To me, those words are chock full of hope and pride and love of land. So much so that they should be considered not just a formal preamble to a legal document, but a constant reminder of the meaning of the remaining provisions of the document, a sort of moral and spiritual mooring for the Constitution." And it is that love of land that, and by land, I think we all mean the land, the water, the air, everything around us. But in K. Ross Toole's book, in his final chapter, which he called "It is a Long Haul," he made this statement. He says, "This is the land of the big sky, and whatever else it had elbow room, clean air, pristine rivers, and crystal lakes. But have we?" And then he said, "Ask the resident of Missoula, that lush green valley town, now often hidden entirely from view by the stinking yellowish gray smog of a pulp plant. Ask the resident of Columbia Falls, where the effluent from an aluminum plant that has yellowed every pine tree for miles around. Ask the resident of Billings, where the stink of oil refineries stretch all the way to Laurel." And then he says this, and this is what I think is so important to organizations like the Clark Fork Coalition. Ask those dozens of conservationists now locked in combat with the giant polluters if we really have a big sky, or if indeed, in spite of the intensity of the fight in the environmentalists, we are really going to win this one. We have lost so many battles in the 20th century. On what can they base their optimism concerning this one? And he goes on, and what he comes up with, the fact is that it's the land. That is why the environmentalists in Montana will win. The battle's not being fought in the laboratory or in the legislature or the courts or other losing battles, as other losing battles have been. This one is utterly visceral. If the fight against environmental degradation can be won anywhere, it will be won here. Precisely because nowhere in America is that visceral relationship with the land more powerfully felt than by those who live here. Thank you, K. Ross Toole, for both his prescience in that and the inspiration that he certainly provided to me in 1971 and 72.
Lily, could I need to make a little plug here.
You are definitely up next, Justice Nelson. Go for it.
Mae Nan was not going to plug herself, obviously, but you've got to read the Constitution, but you've got to also read the transcripts of the debates at the Constitutional Convention to realize the prescience of the delegates. They were looking generations into the future in what they did at that convention and the rights they adopted. Montana was one of 38 states at the time that rewrote or amended their constitutions. It was 72 was a banner year for state constitutional law, but our delegates, Mae Nan among them, obviously, did such a fine job of looking into the future, looking at Montana not as it was, but what it should be, what it could become, and incorporating those values and that vision into the provisions of Montana's Constitution. Just for, if you're interested in reading these things, the convention transcripts, among other documents, there's a website called Montana Resources. It's through the state law library, or maybe through the Montana court system website, but it's called Montana Resources. You can Google it. And among other documents in that particular collection of documents is the full transcripts of the Montana Constitutional Convention. Here's why it's so important. I just can't stress this enough. And Alex will probably touch on this, I hope. Last I heard, there was a bill to call the Constitutional Convention. And I suppose the reason for that would be to rewrite the Constitution. I will tell you this with 100% absolute certainty. The 1972 Constitution could not be written in this time in our state's history. It would not happen. So if you value the rights under our present Constitution, again, you need to fight for those. Two things about the right to a clean and healthful environment. First of all, the Montana Supreme Court in the MEIC case, the 1990 case that I mentioned, held that the right to a clean and healthful environment was what's called a fundamental right. And fundamental rights in our Constitution are the rights that are most hotly protected by the court system. They're subject to what's called strict scrutiny. In other words, if the legislature passes any kind of law or rule that impinges on a fundamental right, that law has to be supported by a compelling state interest and be narrowly fashioned to accomplish only the interests that the state sets forth. And compelling state interest is a high bar, believe me. So it's a fundamental right. And then, as Mae Nan pointed out, there really are two components to the right to a clean and healthful environment. There's Article 2, Section 3, which is in Article 2, obviously, of the Constitution. That's a fundamental right. But then you also have to look at Article 9, Section 1. And again, this is important. And I'll just read it to you. It says, the state and each person. Now that means that it's not only the state, the government has this obligation. It's every one of us. It's every person in the state. And oddly enough, constitutional rights are usually dictates for a governmental power or against a governmental power. Usually the Constitution doesn't prohibit or allows private activity, but this one does. The state and each person shall maintain and improve. And those are the magic words, and improve a clean and healthful environment in Montana for present and future generations. So right there in the Constitution, Article 9, Section 1, the legislature has a duty, a constitutional duty, to not only maintain a clean and healthful environment, but it has the duty to improve it for this and future generations. So again, when you see bills in the legislature that are trying to degrade the environment, to take away some of the fundamental rights that you have to a clean and healthful environment, that's the time you start getting on the phone, on the emails with your representatives, your senators, and you let them know that as a citizen, you're not going to stand for it anyway.
Absolutely. So I did, Justice Nelson, and to the audience, I put a link to this case that where Justice Nelson is referring to in the comments section, and it'll come up on Facebook as well. But Justice Nelson, one of the favorite quotes from that ruling or that opinion that I have in front of me is that our Constitution does not require that dead fish float on the surface of our state's rivers and streams before its environmental protections are invoked. And that's such a powerful interpretation of that right that we have. I'm wondering, before we go on and dig into a little bit more of the usage and how Tracy can tell us how DEQ works with our water quality, if you want to say anything else about interpreting that clean and healthful right.
Well, the only thing I'll say is it hasn't unfortunately come up all that often. We brought it up in the Cape France versus Pede case. It's mentioned a lot of times, but it's not litigated that often, which I think is sad. I think constitutional rights should be used in litigation. I mean, that's what they're for. It's not often used in litigation. I would hope that some of the young environmental attorneys that are coming up in the state now will start using that provision in our Constitution to flesh out what it means in more greater depth. There's a lawsuit pending in the First Judicial District Court right now before Judge Kathy Seeley that is brought by a number of young people, some disabled people, but mostly young people that are the next generation that's going to be impacted by, or is being impacted already by pollution. And they're litigating their right to have the government realistically and aggressively address climate change. And that's a big global issue, obviously, but it's supported by the right to a clean and healthful environment. And I hope that they're successful in that lawsuit. So we need to litigate it more. We need to use it more. We need to bring it more to the attention of people. People that like to hunt and fish and do these sorts of activities that maybe, for lack of a better term, stereotypically perhaps, be a little bit on the conservative side. They need to understand that without the right to a clean and healthful environment, without the enforcement of that right, we're not going to have the wildlife to hunt, the birds to shoot, the fish to take as a resource from our state's waters. We're not going to have any of those things. So their rights to recreate are going to be severely damaged if we don't maintain and improve the right to a clean and healthful environment.
Lily, do we have time for a quick question of Justice Nelson?
Absolutely.
Justice Nelson, I wonder if you could share any insights into why sometimes judges will pick up on that clean and healthful environment challenge in certain litigation, in certain cases, and sometimes not. I mean, I can think of 2 or 3 instances at the Clark Fork Coalition, even within the last 5 years, in which we've included a clean and healthful claim, and yet it doesn't get addressed.
Well, there are 2 reasons, Karen. Number one, and you've kind of obviated the first reason, Unless somebody makes it an issue and brings it before the court isn't going to address it. The court doesn't get to write the script. The court gets to use the script that's provided to it. So litigants, if they're going to raise constitutional issues, they need to raise that, brief it, address it, make a record in the district court as to that issue. Then there's a second rule of judicial, there's a second rule that the courts follow. If a lawsuit, if an issue can be decided on a statutory basis, a narrow basis, the court will generally not get into the constitutional question. So they decided on the narrowest basis first. And let me give you an off-topic perfect example of that. Probably most of you are familiar with the Baxter decision, which involved the right to medically assisted dying, physician-assisted dying. The district court grounded her decision to uphold that as a fundamental constitutional right in the right of privacy, Article 2, Section 10, the right of individual dignity, Article 2, Section 4. The court, much to my dismay, did not want to ground the decision in the constitutional right. They thought it would be better to find a statutory basis for upholding that right. And they found it in the Terminally Ill Act and some other statutes that are cited in the decision. So Montanans now don't enjoy a fundamental right to physician aid in dying. Doctors enjoy a right to a defense of consent if they happen to get charged with criminal homicide for providing a right to aid in dying. And I can almost assure you that's one other right that's going to go down the drain during this session or the next. So that's why I think it's important to litigate these constitutional. Once a decision is grounded in a constitutional right, especially a fundamental constitutional right, the legislature can't hardly mess with it. You have to amend the Constitution. So it's a lot more secure to the people. Does that answer your question? Or no?
Thank you.
Right.
No, and thanks for sharing that, Justice Nelson, because you hear about, environmental groups and lawsuits and in a derogatory manner sometimes, but it sounds like you're saying there's room for that litigation to add power and add to our understanding of what this clean and healthful right really extends to and what it means. There's still room in Montana for us to better define that.
There's
a lot of room. Well, so if you are joining us out there and you haven't got the spiel yet, we are talking with our speakers here about Montana's bedrock water protection laws. We've heard about the 1972 Constitutional Convention. Justice Nelson just gave us an overview of how the courts have used that Constitution to interpret, our rights to that clean and healthful environment. Now, of course, in our government system, the courts have one job, and our legislature and our laws and our agencies are a whole nother branch out there. And we are joined today by Tracy Stone-Manning, who has a little bit of experience on that law and agency side of this machinery. So Tracy, thank you for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to you to give us a little bit of insight into how those agencies work when it comes to water protection. I'm wondering if you can start off just by giving the audience like a quick mission of what the DEQ does, and then maybe talk about the role of strong or weak water laws.
Sure. and before I jump into, you know, which is regulatory bureaucratic stuff after all this poetry, I have to go back to the poetry for a minute. What Mae Nan was describing, a time when she, as a Missoulian, couldn't see Mount Sentinel, when just a couple years before that, literally the Clark Fork River ran red in Missoula from mine waste in Butte 120 miles upstream. Before we had the Clean Air Act, before we had the Clean Water Act, there's that incredible seismic shift because of citizen leaders, because of Mae Nan and 99 other citizen leaders who said, this is what we see for our future. And so that's what sort of imbues me with continued optimism on how Montana can chart her path forward, because when citizens band together, really good things happen, right? And so, so we had a suite of federal laws in the early 70s. The Montana state legislature came in and matched them with the equivalent state laws that were meant to enact the rights that we have in the Constitution, right? And so there at the Department of Environmental Quality, our job was to ensure that our laws were being followed. And the theory is that if the laws are being followed, then the Constitution is being upheld. Beautiful theory. Not quite always there in practice, right? There were, if there was a magic wand that I could have held at DEQ and said, I've got this toolbox and called the Montana Code annotated, I don't have enough law in that toolbox to really enforce the Constitution. I felt at times, and that's why we're constantly improving. In theory, the legislature makes laws every 2 years that has us do better, that has us refine how it is that we're going to implement the Constitution and cut our peace with the land. And then sometimes the legislature falls down and the citizens say, all right, we've had it, we're going to do it. And so that's how, for example, we have a law that says you can't build a cyanide heap leach mine in Montana, because citizens said, yeah, we're done with that. We don't want that. We don't want that for the headwaters of the Blackfoot River. We don't want it anywhere in our state, so we're going to pass our own law, right? So there's this constant ability to keep getting better. And let me be clear, if the citizens did not pass that ban, we would have fought for a very long time one of the world's 10 largest gold mines at the headwaters of the Blackfoot River. And perhaps an organization like the Clark Fork Coalition, NMEIC, would have found a case to stop it on constitutional grounds. In fact, the 99 case did come out of the Blackfoot effort, but maybe not before real damage had been done. So for everybody sort of listening, the beautiful thing about democracy is it is an active sport. You can advocate hard at the legislature, and when the legislature doesn't cut it, you can band together with your fellow citizens and make the laws that we need. I would argue that our hard rock mineral laws are not strong enough. There is not a way that the state of Montana can say no to a hard rock mine proposal. They can put a lot of sideboards on it in order to ensure that if there's going to be permanent discharge, that it's going to be cleaned. But they can't say no. There is not a law out there that says, add all this stuff up and this is the wrong place for that particular proposal. And we're smart enough now to understand geology. We're smart enough to say, hey, if we bore into that rock, it's gonna create acid mine drainage for the next 100 generations. And we just don't wanna do that to the future, because that violates who and what we are as a people, it violates DEQ's mission, violates the Constitution. That law does not exist today.
And it's instances like that, those, right, Tracy, where the agencies kind of come to depend on some of that same litigation that Justice Nelson was talking about, to give them.
Absolutely. And I had, when I was sitting in the director's chair, I had people say to me, well, you can't permit X because that would violate the Constitution. And I would say, it's not my job as the director of the Department of Environmental Quality to interpret the Constitution. That's the court's job. I implement the laws that the legislature gives the department. And arguably, if we do it badly, we can get, the court can tell us you did it badly. Or the court can say, the court can find on constitutional grounds, hey, no, that's unconstitutional. But as the director of DEQ, I couldn't say, I'm not signing this piece of paper because it's not constitutional. The extra step was required.
Although you do have this really great story, Tracy, as that I think just really shows the leadership that you have within the agency that we can expect. And that's a story of that you told about the Smith mine and the permitting and interpreting and acting on the spirit of a law. And would you mind sharing that with us again?
Sure. When I had the honor to be the director of the department, the Smith River mine proposal was just in its really early stages. And the company had come forward and asked for an exploration license. And the Montana Code, the law that issues exploration licenses, says the state of Montana shall issue a license. Not may, not it was shall. You write your $150 or whatever it costs, you get an exploration license. DEQ got to put parameters around the activities in that license, but we shall do it. And of course, it's our beloved Smith River, so it was already in the newspapers. There was clearly public interest. And so I said to my colleagues in the Mining Bureau, hey, we probably need to do an environmental assessment around that exploration license. And they were like, yeah, we don't have to. I was like, yes, I understand we don't have to, but there's great public interest and the law allows for us to do that. And so perhaps we should be beginning to get all that public interest in upfront. So citizens are engaged in this process from the very beginning on how it is we're gonna decide whether, or not even whether, but how to mine here. And so we did. We put together an environmental analysis, and the sky didn't fall, and more people were engaged from the very, very first. And now, you know, like government agencies are made up of these beautiful things called human beings, right? And human beings do, we get into ruts, and so we'll say, well, why do we do it that way? And the answer is, well, because we always do it that way. I think it's a very wise structure that a governor gets to bring in the heads of agencies. So every 4 years or so, there's some new eyes and fresh blood saying, hey, why do we do it that way? And well, why don't we involve the public? So there's definite leeway that way on sort of interpreting the spirit of the law and the spirit of public engagement. That a director can do. But again, I would lobby hard for constantly asking, do we have the right tools to get back to what Justice Nelson talked about, to improve, right? It's the simplest and most beautiful notion, right? That we all work to leave this place better off than we found it. Right? That's what improve means. We just leave it better than we found it. And the question is, do our laws, are they good enough to help guide us that way? And every 2 years we ask that question. And I think people on this flat screen and people joining us are rightly concerned that this legislature might be not figuring out how to improve, but figuring out how to undo.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Tracy. And in a few minutes here, we're going to have Alex Leone, one of my colleagues at the Clark Fork Coalition, on with us to talk a little bit about what is being seen in the legislature right now. And And I'm really excited, and I know lots of people out there are really excited to hear that as well. Again, if you are in the audience and you have questions that you'd like to pose to us, the Q&A feature on Zoom will get those questions to us. On Facebook, you can put them in the video comments. We're kind of closing in on our time when we really want to devote to answering those questions. But Karen, it's come up time and time again, the ability of citizens to ensure that machinery works. And I know there's really great examples from your time with the Clark Fork Coalition. We've talked about the Milltown example, which I think shows where there might not be the machinery in place until the citizens start to move it and to build it. And so I'd love to hear, kind of your thoughts on where we are in this conversation and the role of that citizen engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Lily. I think I'd like to play off of some of the points that Tracy made and also Justice Nelson and Mae Nan. I keep coming back to the fact that, okay, here we have this powerful constitutional provision in place with a built-in imperative that the legislature is supposed to improve the environment. And all this is amplified by strong environmental laws and competent state environmental agencies. So, as a package, it's truly a fine bit of legal and regulatory machinery that we have here in Montana. And yes, as Tracy has said, it doesn't mean that our wildlife corridors and clean air automatically get protected, or that our historically hardworking river systems magically become free of pollution and packed with wild trout, or that climate resiliency just happens. So when you get right down to it, it's really just words on paper and legislators and regulators at desks if there is no political will to put the laws to work for our lands, our waters, and our skies. So I think we've all seen that political will can be a really hard thing to come by, because you need enough decision makers with power and authority and that intensity of commitment to make those laws go to work for our environment. And I would say that that's especially true in this hyper polarized political milieu that we have nationally, and also in the single party dominated situation we have in Montana right now. So this is where the people come in. It's the citizens of Montana who care deeply about the environment. And as you've alluded to, Lily, we've seen time and time again in clean water campaigns at the Clark Fork Coalition that it's the energy of the people and the advocacy groups that they support and actually they built that really breathe this essential political will to life. I mean, without those active, engaged citizens, our watershed would be a very, very different place. So yes, some examples. As Tracy mentioned, yeah, we'd have a gigantic open pit gold mine with cyanide saturated tailings sitting right at the headwaters of the Blackfoot River, with an unreclaimed and abandoned Mycorrhiza mine just a few miles upstream. We'd also have colossal copper mines under the Cabinet Mountains wilderness, discharging perpetual pollution into the Clark Fork, permanently drying up bull trout strongholds and threatening wilderness lakes and streams. We'd also have a petroleum pipeline running right through the 9 Mile. We'd have massive subdivisions with each house on its very own unmonitored well and septic system sitting right at, catch this, the mouth of Rock Creek. That was a big battle. One at Clearwater Junction up the Blackfoot, one next to the Lee Metcalf Wildlife Preserve in the Bitterroot. And we'd also still have a dam and a contaminated reservoir sullying the confluence of the Clark Fork and Blackfoot rivers. But guess what? We don't have any of those dangerous and ill-advised projects causing harm to human health and the environment. Why? It's the citizens. It's citizens of this watershed and the nonprofit conservation groups that they've supported that got to work, whether it was by affecting legislation or influencing agency decisions and rulemakings, or bringing challenges to the court for judges and justices like Justice Nelson to shed light on what needs to happen next. Or there's also simply by elevating the issue in the court of public opinion. And sometimes, most of the time, actually, it takes all of the above to achieve environmental success stories. And Tracy, I want to draw you in because you and I were talking about the Milltown Dam removal campaign last week. You were at the helm of the Clark Fork Coalition during that campaign. Classic case in point. We had to pull out all the stops. There just wasn't one angle. I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, and Karen is being modest for her organization. The campaign happened because the Clark Fork Coalition launched it. And at the time, people thought, I mean, they looked at us and they were like, you want to what? Oh, that's cute. And I mean, people thought it was nutty. But in part, it seemed nutty because there was no one obvious agency. There was no one obvious law that we could lever to say, okay, fix that. The Superfund law is pretty clear about what it could do. And the Fish and Wildlife Service was pretty clear about, well, we just care about bull trout and whether they can get past the dam and we can put a ladder in. And so far, the coolers that we're putting the fish in and putting in the back of the truck and driving them around the dam is working. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission said, well, we just have to make sure it's safe. We can't call for it to come out. All of a bunch of different agencies saying, well, yeah, we really care about our little slice of the pie. And nobody looking at the whole pie except the public. Public was saying, we want the whole pie. And please don't bother us with the details of who has the authority to do what. Please just do it. And that level of unbelievable engagement, the community coming deeply alive about visualizing that future, then enabled, gave kind of the authority, the sort of the moral authority to the EPA to find, in fact, their legal authority to get it done. It was a beautiful story. It was all because of the community of Missoula and the people in it who said, yeah, we want this to happen.
Such a great story. So speakers, I think that we're starting to wind down. If you're in the audience, we had planned to be here until 6:30. I do have some questions that people sent in ahead of time for us to kind of answer. Along with answering your questions, we are going to bring Alex Leone up on the screen so he can work with us, kind of tell us what's up with the legislature right now. And you guys have hit on this, our speakers. Again, thank you so much for joining us. There's so much information and so much good information, knowledge to get from what you guys are saying. I'm wondering if before we get into question and answers, if you guys want to leave any kind of last remarks about what this moment feels like to you right now, where we are politically, and any last messages for the audience. And we can do that. We can maybe go ahead and if you want to answer, just jump in if you have something on that.
I think politically, we need to all be concerned. And I've said more than enough on that subject, but now is not the time to let your guard down, believe me.
I would say, I guess to kind of quote K. Ross Toole again, it's still a long haul, and it's going to be a really long haul this session, but we have come a long way. I mean, I really think when you consider how things were in the late 60s and early 70s, thanks to groups like yours, thanks to the court, thanks to the Constitution, thanks to subsequent legislatures, we have come a long way. But one thing that's so important, guys, to keep in mind, as great as our Constitution is, it only passed by 2,368 votes. And it was a strong rural-urban divide. So many of those things that made it such a hard road to get there still exist in Montana. They haven't gone away. And The studies are complete in terms of who favored the Constitution. They tended to be urban. They tended to be Democrats. They tended to be young. So it's a continual challenge, but thankfully we do have the tools, and like Justice Nelson, I concur that if we had to try to get this we would not be able to get this same Constitution passed today.
So let's answer some of these questions that are coming in from the audience, you guys. There's some really good ones, unless Tracy or Karen, you wanted to jump in on that, the now of the moment.
Just one quick message there, which is don't undervalue the value of values, right? That back to that sort of visceral place of who and what we are as Montanans and what we ultimately care about and what we want for our children and our grandchildren. There is so much common ground there. It's how we define the common ground that sometimes we get in fights over, but the common ground absolutely exists. And I would just urge people to do the coming work with that notion that we agree on values.
That's such an excellent point, Tracy. And it gets to one of the questions that has kind of come in just now about comparing the benefits of like ongoing relationships with stakeholders versus the importance of this litigation. And kind of what you're saying is those common values are there. The environment is a really Montanan value. It is shared. I think what we were getting at with the role of litigation is defining, there's room for some definition work in what our right is there. But does anybody else want to talk about the role of greater collaboration to solve these problems versus the role of litigation, or the instances where those might be called in? It's a big question. Thank you, Justine. It's a great question.
Yeah, I can jump in real quick, Lily. I mean, absolutely, there's a huge role for collaboration. And it seems like when stakeholders do collaborate, new ideas emerge. That means perhaps you don't have to apply the pressure at the state legislature level or in the regulatory sphere or have the courts make a decision. So yeah, that is absolutely true. And I would say that as long as that list was of areas where we did have to pull out the stops and do the constant pressure, constantly applied dance, there's just as long a list of places where we relied exclusively on collaboration to rebuild tributaries, to clean up and restore, trout streams. It really isn't some of that on the ground work where you can have conversations with landowners about shared values. I mean, Tracy said this before, nobody wakes up and says, okay, how am I going to pollute the river how am I going to degrade the environment? So I think that's a great reminder that Tracy has put out there, which is there's such agreement. I know that the Blackfoot Challenge emphasizes this all the time, and I love it. The 80-20 rule, there's 80% of the things that we all agree on. The 20%, well, that's for probably those advocacy groups like the Clark Fork Coalition to settle out. But yeah, collaboration, absolutely critical.
And to follow up on that point, in terms of litigation, I agree with Karen. If to the extent that you could get agreement by collaboration, litigation, I think necessarily needs to be a last resort. And it needs to be a last resort for several reasons. For one thing, it's enormously expensive, which somebody has to pay for and fund. It takes a long time to get a result, and there's every real possibility you may not like the result you get once you get it. It polarizes people, litigation does. There's winners and there's losers. So as much as I was part of that process and as much as I stand by my comments, if you're going to litigate the constitutional right, I don't suggest that that's the way to get this forward progress that we need. I mean, God knows, just look at Congress. You know, they haven't accomplished anything in the last 5 years. So, you know, that's why this polarization has got to stop. It really does. We're not getting it.
That's the beautiful thing about collaboration. You really, when you sit down at the table and try to really hear what the person you're at the table with is saying and what their needs are, everything softens, right? It becomes a dialogue as opposed to a fight. It's really hard to sit across from the table and make that person the enemy, because the person isn't the enemy, right? They just are coming at a problem differently than you are, and in our really polarized world, which is made worse by a pandemic because we can't sit down at the table and have a cup of coffee. I'm so looking forward to coming back to a time when we can do that, when we get out of our respective echo chambers and our own news feeds that give us all the news hits that we want and make us feel righteous. And instead just really getting out on the ground and talking to people. It's really hard work, but you make really good friends, and you literally end up seeing landscape differently. It's really important work.
So here's another question that came in, and then I saw Alex, you jumped off, but after that, they're pretty specific questions to what's happening in this legislative session. So this question that you guys might be able to help answer though is, oops, I'm looking at the wrong one here. Sorry. Is this idea of federal regulations and state regulations. So if we expect some water quality threats to come to the surface at the state level, are those likely going to be under the precedence of federal environmental regulations?
I'll try to be really fast here. So the Montana Department of Environmental Quality has what's called primacy, meaning that it gets to implement the Federal Clean Water Act, the Federal Clean Air Act. And so if you are a developer and you want a Clean Air Act permit, you work with DEQ to get the permit. Now, if DEQ were to become just rubber stamp and not actually work on a permit, eventually the feds could come in and take that authority away and implement the laws themselves. But at the moment, the state implements them. And when we have state water quality laws and air quality laws, sometimes they're tougher, right? There are some provisions in our laws that are tougher than the feds, and those provisions prevail. A really great example is the waters of the US. Montana defines waters in a restrictive is the wrong word, but in a more encompassing fashion than the federal government did. You remember when everybody said, oh my God, the sky is falling. Well, the secret was the Montana Water Quality Act defines waters in an even more broad definition than the feds do. And we've been doing business just fine for a really long time. So our law held because it was stronger.
Awesome. Thanks, Tracy. Alex, I'm going to bring you up onto screen. I'm going to ask Alex Leone to start his video. He is our restoration policy manager. He's also our guy keeping tabs on what's going on in the legislature. I am going to throw up in the chat a couple links that you can use to track what's going on in the legislature, that you can use to sign up to join a water watchdog team, get updates from Alex and from our team of policy people at the Clark Fork Coalition. Alex, I'm wondering, do you want to go right into an overview, or do you want to answer? We have a question here about I-186. We have a question about some pesticide runoff. Changes to any DEQ regulations we're expecting. Do you want to give us your quick update before we do those?
Yeah, let me just do a quick update if that works. And I want to start off by just saying I think that, you know, as all the panelists that have been chatting earlier have kind of discussed, we're sitting in a really good place right now. Compared to neighboring states, Montana's water quality laws are kind of the envy of a lot of the states around us. And I think in Montana, we've built up a series of water quality rules that kind of reflect our standards as people, which is really neat. Talking about the cyanide heap leach ban that Karen and Tracy worked on for a long period of time, just over our borders in Idaho and South Dakota, there's active cyanide mines going on. So we are fortunate. We are kind of, I think, we just got to take that. We shouldn't take that for granted, though. So as an organization, the Clark Fork Coalition's pretty focused on some pretty narrow, kind of a narrow set of legislation. We're really concerned about any bill that impacts water quality in the Clark Fork. And I think that that narrow focus gives us a little bit of a heads up. It gives us more time to focus on certain pieces of legislation that are super concerning, and it keeps our geography and our community kind of in the basin, which is helpful. So for this session, I'm going to go pretty quick. I'm just going to give you a broad overview on like the three major topics that we're looking at, and then just dive into one bill and some other legislation that we're worried about coming up. So for this session, our major priorities are water quality, surprise, surprise, exempt wells. Exempt wells are just wells that are dug kind of outside of the permitting system. It's been a big topic for the Clark Fork Coalition for over a decade. And then we're also tracking a very interesting hydrogen project that's being proposed up near the headwaters near Butte. All of these topics, again, the session's kind of going slowly. There's all legislation and bills attached to these three topics. But as of right now, there's only a couple things we're tracking really closely, and I'm going to get into that right now. So one of the things that's on our front burner is Senate Bill 164. And this bill, as Tracy mentioned earlier, it's one of those bills that actually, Senate Bill 164 is attempting to weaken one of Montana's standards that's stronger than the federal standard. So in Montana, we have a nitrate groundwater discharge standard that's a little bit stronger than the federal standard. Right now, there's a piece of legislation out there that would put us at the federal standard. We are concerned about this for numerous reasons. We have nitrate causes a lot of issues when it combines with other things in the water, and it creates a lot of algae. So folks that watched the news last year, there was big algae blooms on the Smith River, on the Gallatin River, on the Clark Fork River, and we're seeing increased algae blooms. We've seen increased algae blooms over the last decade. So nitrate's one of the problems that causes those blooms. Even though Montana standards may be a little bit more stringent than the federal standards, we have issues. Nutrient issues are increasing. And this is one of the only levers we have to actually kind of limit the amount of nitrate that gets put in groundwater. So we don't want to backpedal on this one. Another issue with elevated levels of nitrate in groundwater is it's really bad for babies and nursing mothers when it's above a certain level. So there's a human health impact on this as well. We have kind of started to rally some of our water watchdog supporters to try to get this bill stopped in the committee right now. So we have on our website, we have instructions on what we want folks to do, but for Senate Bill 164, we're really looking for people to call in to the Senate committee and tell them they think this is a bad bill. The hearing's tomorrow. So for folks that are interested, check our website out. It'll lead you and give you instructions on what we want folks to do on that one.
I'm going to stop you really quick for that. We do have the link to the CFC bill tracker or legislative info page and the MEIC bill tracking page up in the comments right now. Copy, paste those in your browsers, keep track of them. MECI does a great job preparing and talking about how to testify. Unfortunately for the hearing tomorrow, I don't think that you can testify in person, but you can still submit written comments into that committee. So those resources to help you do that are right there in the comments right now.
So yeah, so thanks, Lily. And again, just to summarize, this Senate Bill 164 is bad because it would lower our standards when it comes to allowing nitrate to get into the groundwater. Right now, our standard's awesome because it's better than the feds. We want to keep it that way. So that's kind of the summary on that one. Then the only other stuff that's right in the hopper, and this is what we kind of expected, is over the last few sessions, we've had a really awesome kind of ability to veto legislation that kind of was detrimental for environmental causes. What we're starting to see now is folks are just regurgitating legislation from especially 2017 related to exempt wells. So I'm sure Karen's just incredibly excited to, I actually was looking up a veto letter from 2017 today because it's just the same stuff, the same topics are being brought up. So when it comes to exempt wells, we're going to need our supporters again. Sorry, folks, but this is not going to go away. And so just kind of be up, we'll keep folks apprised. Please sign up for our water watchdog list, but I don't want to get into the details right now of anything else. It's been a long night. And following up on those panelists, I just feel like a peon. So thank you for giving me time to talk and appreciate everyone tuning in. So thank you.
Alex?
Hey, Lily, one quick thing.
Yes,
When I've had legislators say, I've had people from industry say, but Montana's laws are tougher. They're more strict. And I say, right, because Montana's better. We have more to protect. Of course they're stricter. We're just a better place. Let's keep it that way. It's a nice way for people to realize, oh, right, we're special for a reason because we fought hard for it.
Yep. And if today's civics lesson has impressed anything, it is that the fight continues, that we depend on engaged communities for sure. In respect to you guys this time, in respect to our audience, I just thank you so much, speakers, for joining us. There is a testament to how valuable your community sees what you're saying is, because we've had 0 people drop off during this entire hour and a half. So thank you so much for sharing all of that information, all of that perspective with us. If you are out there in the audience, thank you so much for being one of those engaged citizens and coming to this presentation to get this information, to get these tips on how to be more involved. I have just a few things to throw in the chat for you. If you are not familiar with the legislature, if you're not familiar with committee hearings, I highly encourage you to check it out on your own. So I will put up a link to legislative information. You can go and explore how that's all set up. I'm also going to put in a link so you can go and watch this committee hearing tomorrow that's going to be looking at some of these bills. You can watch and see what that process is like. It'll only help you be more prepared for jumping into this flat screen platform and lending your voice to the cause later in the session. So to wrap up again, panelists, thank you so much. If you would like to stick around, maybe turn off your videos as we say goodbye to our audience, and I'd love to have you come back on after the room is empty just to touch base, but go ahead and turn your cameras off. Thank you so much. And I am right now going to put in, first is a link so that if you do want to watch some of those committee hearings, that link is now in the comments. There are other issues that you want to be engaged on outside of these environmental issues, I just sent you a calendar so that you can go and see what's going on. And then there's one more that I want to give everybody, and this is just your 2021 legislative session info. This page will tell you who's on your committee. You can look up your specific legislator and see where they are acting in this session. So that's a really great one to explore. All right, everybody out there, if you are still in our room, again, thank you so much for joining our conversation today. If we didn't get to your questions, we'll work on getting those answered via email. Some really great things got brought up, and we'll try and get you the best answer as soon as possible. For those, please don't be offended if I kick you out of the room now. Thanks so much for joining us.